Hi. Hi. Hey. All right. Cool. So welcome to yet another awesome panel that we have lined up for your different games. In this panel on representation then and now, we have amazing presenters. Adrienne Shaw is an assistant professor in the Department of Media Studies and Production at Temple University, and a media and communications PhD program faculty member. Her primary areas of research are video games, gaming culture, the politics of representation, gender and sexuality, and qualitative research. She is author of the book Gaming at the Edge, Sexuality and Gender at the Margins of Gamer Culture. Evan W. Lauteria is a PhD candidate there. Or still student? Oh, sorry. Student in sociology at the University of California, Davis, where he worked in the UC Davis Mod Lab in interdisciplinary digital humanities and video games research lab. His primary research interests include production of culture, formal organizations, video games, gender and sexuality, and comparative historical methods. He is the co-editor of Rated M for Mature, Sex and Sexuality in Video Games, and his current research is a comparative historical analysis of Nintendo and Sega's business practices in the 1980s and 90s. And Emma Leigh Waldron is a PhD candidate recently. So congratulations. Can we actually give her a round of applause for that? That's really awesome. In the Performance Studies graduate group of the University of California, Davis, and co-editor-in-chief at the online journal Analog Game Studies. Emma's work lies at the intersection of performance studies and media studies and focuses on affective communities that coalesce around intimate performances of touch. She is currently researching the mediated intimacy of ASMR videos on YouTube and how sex is represented in LARP, live action role play. And so I'll turn it over to these presenters.
All right, I am now tired and regretting that burrito I had for lunch. So the title of our talk is Making Queer Games History, and it's about a work in progress of building a digital archive of LGBTQ video game content dating back to the 1980s. And I will say before I start that there are some homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic content that will pass over very quickly, but we won't talk about them in much detail. And there are also not particularly violent examples, which we will not discuss in this talk, but if that is a content or trigger warning for you, before we get to the examples, I recommend stepping out. So, the reason I started building this digital archive of LGBTQ video game content was because I was tired of answering this question. People always ask me when I talk about the fact that I study LGBTQ video game representation. And while I could say yes over and over again, a lot of people were simply not aware of the long history of queer and queer-related and LGBTQ content generally in video games history. And it has been both in existence and growing along with the growth of video games more generally. So over the past year, I've been building a digital archive that's going to be publicly available by the first week of May. Don't hold me to May 1st, but first week of May, I promise. That is documenting queer games history as far as I've been able to document it so far, which is up through 2000, and then we have a lot of games from 2000 to 2016, and it's an ongoing process of researching those games. And one of the things we did to do this work is first collect how many games we could find that had LGBTQ game content, and we did that a couple different ways. One, we went to Wikipedia, don't tell my students, and started with the list of LGBT video game characters. We then went through the plethora of online lists of LGBT characters that have been published on an almost yearly basis since the early 2000s. Put all that into a massive spreadsheet, creating rows for each individual game and then rows for each individual instance of content, whether that was a character, a joke, a gay bar location, a cross-dressing mission. And then researching step by step, trying to find out if that content that was listed on that Wikipedia page or that one-off Tumblr was actually what we might describe as LGBTQ game content. And some of that unpacking practice led to dead ends in some respects. So one example was It Came from the Desert from 1989, which is a point-and-click adventure game. And so in the Wikipedia list, in 1989, Cinemaware released It Came from a Desert for multiple platforms. In the game, the player encounters Jackie, a lesbian girl who crashed her car with her girlfriend. Seemed straightforward. Kept searching to find out what we could. On a Tumblr list of lesbian characters in games, we found It Came from the Desert, 1989, minor character, couldn't find her name. This game is set in 1951. That's it. That is the entirety of the internet record for this character being a lesbian that we could find. So we went to wikis, we went to game reviews, and tried to find out more information about the game, read multiple different walkthroughs, found a character list that describes Jackie, and describes Jackie as a woman who has left her mobster boyfriend and run away to the desert, and then spoiler alert, their car is attacked by giant ants. That's all I could find, though. I found no reference to a girlfriend or a lesbian. And so I finally tracked down a long play and watched the 1 hour and 10 minutes of the game to find out what examples of this character being a lesbian I could find in the game. And what I found were a couple screenshots, 2 from the long play itself, which is clearly done on sort of a remastered version, and 1 that somebody had posted to a game wiki. And what I found was what I think they were referencing. The first one, I was asleep in the back of the seat of the car when all of a sudden my girlfriend screams. Later, girlfriend's gone and the car is stuck in the sand. And then in the other one, she's explaining how they left her ex-boyfriend, and her girlfriend stole the car. Now, when I watched this, and granted I was doing this research in the middle of the night, I was like, well, no. She obviously means girlfriend in sort of the colloquial, heterosexual, platonic lady friend sense, right? Gal pals. It's very much in the sort of genre of Thelma and Louise. When I showed this to my students, who are largely much younger than me, they didn't see that way. They interpreted this as they are clearly in a relationship. She ran away from her boyfriend with her girlfriend. Based on when the game came out, based on the ways in which the term girlfriend was used in the 1980s and early 1990s, it is my assessment that this was just a rumored game versus a representation of a lesbian in a game. And this is the process we went through for every single game on the list. We are currently through 200 games on the list, and there are another 150 left to go. In the process of going through every single example of content, the other thing we're doing is categorizing that content. So a lot of them are examples of LGBTQ characters, and that LGBTQ isn't even the best acronym for that. It includes asexual, bisexual, gay, gender non-conforming, intersex, lesbian, non-binary, playable characters, queer men and queer women, rumored and transgender characters, and those are not mutually exclusive categories. It also obviously includes same-sex romance options, though that's much less of the content than one would originally expect. Actions in the game, from sort of very effeminate, homosexualized finishing moves to a lot of cross-dressing missions, and Final Fantasy did not invent that. It's been around since the 1980s. Locations like gay bars, artifacts like gender-bending cosmic machines, traits, mentions, games that overall have queer themes or are about queer people, homophobic and transphobic content, Easter eggs, things that are changed in localization, intertextual references, and player mods, all of which are included in the game. So on one hand, in the process of detailing the game's history, we are trying to find out what the original text said, but we're also including queer readings of games as evidence of queer content dating in the video game history. Unsurprisingly, there aren't that many playable LGBTQ characters. Sort of the top 3, Curtis from Phantasmagoria, Hannah and Rain in Fear Effect 2, and Trevor Phillips in GTA 4 are all represented as bisexual. And Curtis and Trevor in particular are only ever actually shown having sex with women. Or in sort of transmedia texts like Willow and Buffy the Vampire Slayer, they represent her, you can't see that very well, but they represent her with her girlfriend Tara in the Chaos Bleeds edition of the game. I'm going to go through some random themes that the qualitative analysis pulled off, including gay cops, which is a random but recurrent theme. The gay police chief in Go-Go Ackman 3 also represents another theme, which is the representation of leather daddy-esque characters, particularly in Japanese games, often as villains. Also often portrayed as villains are transgender characters, and more often than not, the online lists are listing characters as transgender who are more likely to be labeled cross-dressers. That's a sort of conflated in the fan record of it. There are also lots of cross-dressing and gender-swapping game events. Lesbian, possibly traveling companions, especially in the 1990s games. Characters who are gay or might be European is a common theme. As well as characters who are gay or might be Bishonen, which Evan will talk about in a little bit. The gay best friend who wants to be more than friends with the game protagonist. Master-slave relationships, and oddly enough, these look very similar across different decades and genres. Same-sex romance options have been discussed a lot, and that is what a lot of the more contemporary content includes. But one of the more problematic aspects of representation in these games that people haven't talked much about is the fact that sex workers are almost always represented as bisexual, conflating sex work with sexual identity. In addition, the two games, spoilers, the two games that had by far the most amount of LGBTQ content, at least in the archive so far, in addition to Elder Scrolls, which we haven't tapped into yet, are Leisure Suit Larry and Grand Theft Auto. Now, on the one hand, it might be surprising given the fact that both of these games are sort of directed towards a very specific hegemonic masculine heterosexual male audience, but they're also both completely marketed on their edgy badness, and so I don't think that the presence of LGBTQ content in them is so much surprising as it is part of their marketing hook. Both games have a ton of examples, and even like the listing in the archives doesn't account for all of it because Grand Theft Auto alone had over 100 instances across 12 games in its series. Interestingly, Leisure Suit Larry and Grand Theft Auto, probably owing to the fact that they have so much LGBTQ content, also have a much greater diversity of LGBTQ characters than many of the other games that we've looked at. So in Leisure Suit Larry, Kalao La'au is represented as an Asian Pacific Islander. She's Larry's wife, who then leaves him for a biker named Bobby. And then Chablis, who as far as we know is the first transgender woman of color in the archive so far, in 1993's Leisure Suit Larry 6. Grand Theft Auto is even more intense. Grand Theft Auto has at least one LGBTQ character for every race and class position represented in the game. And now, I qualify that by saying they're not necessarily represented well, or are these things that we could call positive representation, but they are there and in much greater quantities than a lot of other games we have looked at. Also, moving away from just characters and relationship options, one of the things that we don't talk much about is the way we can look at LGBTQ content as atmosphere in games. So anything from gay neighborhoods to gay bars to the punny and offensive titles in Grand Theft Auto games, to LGBTQ mentions often in the form of homophobic teasing, often done when a character isn't representing proper heterosexual desire. So in Dragon Warrior 3, if you don't want to engage in puff puff, one of the options the NPC can say is not another homosexual. But that's the qualitative content, which I've been going over for the past year. But more recently, Evan and Emma at UC Davis have been looking at this numerically to get a more comprehensive quantitative count of changes in LGBTQ representation over time. So,
which is not necessarily a better account, right? So what I'm going to illustrate here, at first, before I jump into the actual numbers, is talk about the difficulty in trying to quantify or code queerness, which is largely uncodifiable. And we're only focusing on the first 15 years of the archive, starting in 1985, because it is such a massive sample. So we tried to focus our coding for this particular analysis, building upon the codes for the archive itself, on character identity codes and then game codes. So we've got our character data, which is one form of manifest queer content. It could be a location, it could be an instance or an atmosphere. But we focused on characters for this, trying to build upon more than just queer identity, but also race, or in the case of some sci-fi and fantasy species, as well as how the character exists in relation to the player. So is it playable? Is the character a romance option? Is the character a villain? And then we also focused on game coding to get some more production of culture understanding of how queers come to exist in game culture more generally. So I'm just going to go over some quick information about our coding scheme. For species and race, for this particular analysis, not necessarily for the online archive for people to access, but for this analysis, a bunch of these codes are in fact exclusive, just for analytic purposes. So one cannot be human and non-human in this archive, although we might theorize how one could be in the real world. or in game worlds. And then we coded based on race, white, a person of color, or race indeterminate. I will discuss in more detail race indeterminate, but we wanted to have a code that clarified someone being non-white and then spread further down to give more information about the racial coding within the game. This is a highly subjective process, so Emma is primarily responsible for doing this work, and it followed the same sort of model that Adrienne was describing, where it required a lot of textual archaeology work. So she looks at the game itself, paratextual documentation about the game, how fans have responded to these particular characters, and so there were lots of complications as a result. So we have a catch-all non-human category, which means we can't really compare across species representation. So in this regard, Birdo is exactly the same as the Asari, right? So we don't get a lot of information within the category of non-human. And fantasy and sci-fi universes don't get distinguished either. So someone being an elf versus, again, the Asari, we don't get any information on that. And because fantasy and sci-fi universes construct race, sexuality, and gender differently than the contemporary world, we have difficulty then encoding based on race as a result. We also hit a sort of brick wall with symbolic ethnic coding for whites. So we get a number of European nationalities or pseudo-European nationalities represented, particularly Spanish and Italian, but we don't include that in this particular sample. And non-humans actually, I mean, this is probably no surprise to most of you, non-humans clearly carry racial coding, right? So aliens and non-human species in fantasy universes come to metaphorically and allegorically represent non-white. So in the coding that Emma did, she included that information as best she could, and for this analysis I've excluded it because of how complicated it is. It doesn't mean it's not important, but rather I couldn't quantitatively compare them effectively. And obviously doing this particular coding scheme reproduces racial boundaries. So there is no code for mixed, mostly because in the 15 years that we're looking at, mixed characters didn't really appear. But beyond that, we're relying on textual data that's supposed to hint at the racial category, not necessarily actual demographic data like on the census. So we're often presuming the racial category. We also hit some brick walls of gender and sexuality, even though the archive does a very good job of trying to codify based on fan interpretation, but that's precisely the problem. So we get a lot of people claiming that Sephiroth and Cloud are queer for each other, and there's a lot of slash fic around this. So it's included in the archive, but there isn't a lot of in-text information to provide evidence of this outside of the basic stuff one might use for a queer reading in general. So it's included with a huge question mark. I think it's coded as rumored. So it's one could interpret it this way. There are rumors circulating around the internet to support this. It's maybe not actual representation of queerness. At the same time, we have some problems with coding schemes regarding this that fits in with Cloud and Sephiroth. Coding using Amerocentric terms for LGBTQ identities when we're codifying Japanese representations. So on here I've got Poison and Flea, who really, in terms of their representation visually, look quite similar. Based on different scholarly accounts of who they are, they would have very different codings in the Japanese context. So Poison would be coded as a new half, which is a complex gender, sexuality, and class identity. So it is a reference to primarily male to female transsexual women who only sleep with men and are usually from a working class or sex worker background, right? So that's all coded within that particular identity, and for our codes, it's just transgender, right? So a lot of information is lost because of this, but it still allows for comparison. And Flea in this case would be an Okama, but we've coded Flea as gender non-conforming or non-binary. Obviously, the same thing happens with race when we're talking about the Japanese context, but even in the American and European context, because we have that catch-all non-human category, I've already gone over this. Okay, so that's because I was going to give the example of Usbestia, who illustrates sort of the difficulty of doing gender and sexuality and race simultaneously. So in the American or Anglophone translation, Usbestia is just incredibly sexist and will charge women extra money to learn a certain skill, but that's because in the Japanese he was gay and would give a discount to men because they're attractive. So this required a lot of archaeological work where I found the name of a major character in a neighboring house in his particular town, whose name was changed in translation. Then I found the Japanese name of the town, which was also changed in translation, and then found the Japanese name of the character Aventino, who is Uzbestia, which sound very different, but we can garner from this that because he has a mustache, because he is a musician, and that's the skill he teaches, and his last name ends with Tino, he is theoretically Italian, and his racial coding is white. And is gay because he likes men. Right, so this is it's a lot of archaeological work, but also a lot of subjective interpretation. So this is not necessarily a perfect numerical representation of the data, but rather an interpretation of it. Lastly, for coding, I'm just going to describe how we coded if someone is a player character or not, and if they're an enemy or not. So Emma went to great lengths to code them as player character or non-player character. And members of an ensemble cast or fighting team were coded, in her case, as a non-player character, and for this analysis, I'll do the same. So if they're a member of an RPG team, like a team of 4, if they weren't the protagonist, they were codified as an NPC. So we may need to parse this apart in the future. She also faced some problems with characters who are unlockable, i.e. not playable and then magically playable later, or characters who, in cross-series, will be playable or not playable first, and then playable or not playable later. For enemy categorization, she focuses on if a character is an obstacle to a goal or provides some sort of antagonistic narrative framework for the player's action, that makes the character an enemy. So all villains in a game are enemies because they fit that criteria, but not all enemies are villains. And the reason is because villains are craftier, I guess, or they're like more geared towards actually opposing the character in or the player in her goals. For this analysis, I've eradicated villains, as only 3 in our sample fit that category, and so I've treated player, non-player, and enemy as 3 mutually exclusive categories for analysis. So after all that information, here are some fun charts. So we've got a total of 96 character entries during this time period, so from 1985 to 1999. You'll notice there is an overrepresentation. Oh, it doesn't show up properly. Okay, so the categories are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, gender nonconforming, and rumored at the end. So while characters might be rumored to be one of those other categories, they were treated as separate for this particular chart. You'll notice, unsurprising perhaps, a representation of gay men, and an underrepresentation of other categories. If we take a closer look at bisexual characters, we get sort of a breakdown of how they're represented. So the fact that there are 8 might be interesting or impressive. They are regulated to a series of possible representations. As Adrienne mentioned, sex work and bisexuality are tied together intimately in the early 90s, mostly through the Ultima games, although this makes its appearance later in the archive through other RPGs in particular. Morrigan and Lilith are also non-human bisexual characters. They're succubi, and so their sexuality is then sort of displaced onto their the non-human spatial category. And Tetsuya Suo, who's not released in the US during this time period, is coded as bisexual because of the possible romance options available to him and the hint that he would, by default, potentially be interested in the male character. But as I said, this game wasn't brought over to the US during this time period. So that leads us to what games were brought over and where did they come from. So you'll notice an overrepresentation again of Japanese games. 50% of them, 36, come from Japanese game companies, followed closely by the United States, which produces 28. We also have 1 from Australia, 1 from Norway, and 6 from the United Kingdom. So if we take a closer look at characters that come from Japanese games, we can see a different distribution than we saw in the overall sample. There are, and I've done this by game genre as well, so we can get a better idea of how they're included. Role-playing games and fighting games obviously have a greater number. That's because for fighting games, the roster tends to be more globally diverse, even if highly stereotypical. And role-playing games, by genre default, are about ensemble drama, right? So you're designed to interact with people that are different than you, and conflict or love emerges as a result. So it fits the conventions of these 2 games. What I think is more interesting here, perhaps, is if you'll notice, there are no lesbians. So Japan produces 50% of the games during this time period with queer content and offer no lesbian characters therein. And you already saw the screen with bisexual characters. There just aren't a lot of queer women in general in this sample, outside of highly performative, effeminate trans women. If we break it down by race and species, unsurprisingly, over 50% are white. This is supposed to have a closer breakdown so you can see people of color category, but the sample right now in terms of race is very small. There's one black character, one Latino character, 2 Middle Eastern characters, 2 Pacific Islander characters, and 6 Asian characters, 5 of whom are from Japanese games and are Japanese in their racial or ethnic coding. So we look closer at the characters of color. There is one cut off here, but I'll describe them in detail in a moment. There isn't necessarily a clear trend, except that Leisure Suit Larry and Grand Theft Auto appear quite regularly. They do surprisingly vary in terms of sexual identity along lines of race, and since we don't have enough comparison groups, we can't really make claims at this point as to if, say, blackness is correlated directly with a certain kind of queerness. But we do notice an overabundance, say, of East Asian characters that are primarily Japanese, Zhang Ke being the only one that is not, and he's still from a Japanese game. The bottom one that's cut off is Tatsuya Suyo's love interest, Jun Kurosu, so they are both, again, not translated or borrowed to the US during this time period. And aside from Kalalau, Tatsuya Suyo is the only bisexual person of color. And Kalalau is actually coded as bisexual as an afterthought. She actually appears in Leisure Suit Larry 2 as the love interest and marries Leisure Suit Larry, but in order to prevent the game series from ending, they narratively construct her as actually bisexual and thus pursuing a woman to reinstate Larry's need for heterosexual intercourse. Which I think is important to keep in mind here, right? That like the mere existence of these characters doesn't necessarily tell us much, but it does tell us they exist. And in this particular case, she exists as a narrative drive for heterosexuality. As I mentioned, gay folks are overrepresented, gay men in particular. This is a breakdown in 3-year chunks, since our sample is small at this point, or the years are small. You will notice a fairly standard set of representations across lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and gender nonconforming. And this is for all countries, so if you were to take out Japan, this would look a little different, but not too much different. Whereas gay representation sort of skyrockets at the early 90s, and then into the mid-90s. I'm not sure if this will change as we move forward in the next 15 years of the analysis, but we've sort of theorized that this reflects cultural understandings of queerness during this time period. What's surprising here, however, is if Japan is overrepresented, this doesn't necessarily reflect the data here, since lesbian love romances were common in anime during the 90s. Sailor Uranus and Neptune are great examples. And it also doesn't reflect Japan's rising obsession with performative trans women at the time as well. So that's why we get Birdo and Poison early on in game culture, and that didn't seem to go up over time. So we're not really sure why gayness is the primary mode of representation outside of pre-existing homonormativity. But what is interesting is that gays aren't evil. So we might expect queer folks to be consistently villainous or enemies in these games, and yet they actually decrease over time as represented as bad. Bad in the sense that they provide an obstacle to the player, or bad in that they're actually trying to plot against the player. So what we see actually is an increase in playable characters over time. Not a huge increase, but an increase nevertheless. And a much larger increase in non-player character representation, in that queers come to be important for the narrative dimensions of the game or the construction of the game world. For Japan, this is the best example might be Tony, who was in the slide on Best Friends That Want to Bet the Protagonist, although not the protagonist in that game. One of the other friends. Shigesato Itoi has expressed that he included Tony because there are gay people in the real world, so why wouldn't there be gay people in my game? And I think that's maybe why there are more non-player characters than other forms of representation. Okay. All right.
And one last category that I'm going to go through very quickly just in the interest of time because we have another paper, is one of the things that the archive has kind of uncovered is the sort of longer history of indie queer games that we're not necessarily aware of. So the earliest example of a game by a queer developer for a queer audience is Caper in the Casto by C.M. Ralph from 1988. And it was released on a bulletin board system where people, and it was released as charityware, so people could download it and then were asked to donate that money, the money they would have spent on the AIDS charity of their choice. And then obviously there's sort of the rise of what we might call new queer games in 2012-ish. There's sort of a list of ones everyone, I assume everyone in this room is familiar with: Maddie Greitz's Meninichi, and Anthropy's Dysphoria, Merrick Kopas's Limb. But there is a 20-year gap, and we actually have no idea why that is. I mean, for one, the record of Caper and the Castro is only because of a 2014 interview with the designer where where Luke Winke uncovered it. But also, one of the reasons we're making the archive public at the end of this month is so that people can start adding more games to it. Because part of what might explain the overrepresentation of gay men, for example, might be that those are the characters who people are adding to the list of LGBTQ characters, as opposed to those being sort of all the characters that existed at that time. The other is sort of in relation to a lot of things Evan pointed out in the lack of sort of queer women representation in these first 15 years, is that there's also a lot of historical disconnects in the content itself. So there's not a single representation of gay men or bisexual men in games from the 1980s or 90s that includes a mention of AIDS or HIV at all. And that's particularly surprising given that was the dominant trope of gay and bisexual male representation in all other mediated forms at the time. Whether or not that's a bad thing, I mean, it wasn't necessarily a good thing that that was a dominant trope, but it's fascinating that it was left out of games at the same time. And so this is a work in progress, so we're only going to give like fake conclusions. So there's LGBT content in games, yes, but the trends in that representation is not actually that similar to trends in or reflective of representation in other media, as one might commonly expect. It's not wholly made up of same-sex romance options, as a look at the game studies literature might lead you to believe, or explicitly coded characters. It's not as universally negative as one might expect, which was rather surprising. It hasn't gotten increasingly bad over time, but it also hasn't gotten increasingly better. It's been increasingly ambivalent, or consistently ambivalent. And it has a long history in games, even in games that are not about that. And a lot of the work I've done in the past interviewing game designers about including LGBTQ content in games, one of the main barriers they identify is they don't know how to include it in games that aren't about relationships or about that. And I think especially the Leisure Suit Larry and Grand Theft Auto examples belie that, because when you don't care how you're representing people, apparently there are lots of ways to represent them. So with that, we'll turn it over to our next panelist. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Juan F. Belmonte, who completed his PhD dissertation on gender and sexuality in video games as a research associate at the University of Murcia, Spain. He was a Fulbright scholar at Indiana University, Bloomington, and a visiting researcher at McGill University, Montreal in 2012, and at the IT University Copenhagen in 2013. His research focuses on the particular ways video games relate to ideology at different levels beyond their most direct audiovisual elements.
I can't open the folder for some reason. I'm trying, but it doesn't respond.
That's not good.
It's not my computer, so yeah. Okay, so I'll need a minute, or I hope less, for this to start working and so on.
Does it go?
No, it's open this. It should be, yeah. It shouldn't. Try that one.
Yes.
Oh, maybe it's not compatible with.
Yeah.
Can I use your browser and enter a Prezi, and it will take a minute longer, but.
You're printing information with everyone.
Sorry. It's fine. I mean, I need. Sorry about that. Very good. It's not completely full screen, but as long as you can read that, it's okay. If you can't, I'll try to do something with it, okay? So my name is Juan, and this is the title. That was the title of my presentation, okay? Yeah, feel free to take pictures if you want. My presentation was not originally scheduled here, but I was asked to move it here, and now it's super happy because I think that it is really very well related with their presentation, so I'm happy to be here. And okay, so what I wanted to do is to study the way main characters and villains in JRPGs are constructed. And I wanted to know whether their gender and sexuality is related to the way they are constructed or not, okay? So I started to study about how gender and sexuality have been explained and studied across the years, okay? And I came, or I found Mark McLellan's work, okay? According to him, before 1868, and we will see later why this date is an important one, there were 4 main contexts in which same-sex intercourse, let's say, was a very common practice, even though anal penetration was forbidden by law. Okay, so even though it wasn't allowed at an official level, people at that time, during many centuries, considered sexual intercourse as something normal or even normative in some contexts. Okay, we will see how. So, however, this sex did not happen in places where the status or the rank of the individuals being involved in these situations was challenged or endangered, okay? In fact, these intercourses or these acts were highly regulated, okay, by 2 main moral codes. One was Nanshoku, or male eroticism, and the other one was Shudo, or the way of the youths, okay? Or youths, sorry. Okay, so as I said, there are 4 main contexts, or there were 4 main contexts. The first one was among monks, especially among acolytes and fully fledged monks, older monks, okay? There are several. There's a huge number of historical records and paintings showing sex between monks. Okay, and that's something that still prevails or that still exists in some artistic forms. For instance, in manga. Okay, here you have the work of Hiraya. Okay, he's a very well-known manga artist whose work focuses on stories of men having sex, finding each other in different contexts, and then having sex. And monks and temples are one of his favorite settings. Okay, so the other main context was among or between actors and rich male members of the audience. Okay, and you might ask, okay, but there were also actresses. Okay, that's also true, but only until 1629. Okay, at that time, actresses were forbidden from entering a stage. Okay, according to the people in power, they considered that they were acting or working mostly as prostitutes. Okay, so they were asked to stop working as actresses. And what was the result? Okay, the result was that male actors, okay, who had to adopt or to take on female roles, they had to impersonate female characters, also started to work as prostitutes, both when presenting themselves as male and when presenting themselves as female. Okay. The third context was among owners of small workshops or traveling merchants, okay, who normally lived in carts, in moving carts, okay. The things that they didn't really have the space to form a family, okay. They had a very direct vision. You either have the space or not. So since they didn't have the space to form a family, to have a wife with them, and to have children, they normally hired a younger apprentice, okay, who would live with them, who would share their beds with them, and would also will double up as a wife, cleaning and cooking and so on and so forth. And there are some authors, okay, that have found evidence that some of these apprentices, especially when they were apprentices of people selling spices or medicinal herbs or products, would also prostitute themselves. It was like an expected service that you could request or ask. Okay. Now the fourth and probably the most important, or the one that has had the most or the biggest impact, was about sex among adult samurai and their younger proteges. Okay, as part of their education, it was pretty frequent, okay, for adult samurai, to take under their wings a younger samurai. Okay, it's something that we have already seen in Greece. Okay, education, sex has been there in history, and was there in history as well in Japan. Okay, and this was sex about among these proteges and the samurai was considered to be something usual as long as the samurai, the adult one, did not stop from paying attention to the duties, social duties, such as finding a wife, having children, paying attention to his lord, and so on and so forth. Okay, and another thing was that, here you have the quote for Steve Pinkerton and Paul Abramson. Japanese society traditionally permitted a wide range of non-reproductive sexual styles, both homo and heterosexual, so long as they did not interfere with the primacy of the family unit and the imperative to produce descendants. Okay? So if we go back, or if we try to remember these four contexts, okay, they all have three things in common. Okay, they were rather secluded. Okay, they took place in secluded, restricted spaces. Okay, we think about a workshop or the backstage. Okay, those all those spaces did not have a direct impact on the politics of the daily Japanese life. Okay, they were also understood as transitory. Practices. For instance, once the apprentice stopped being an apprentice, he was expected to become a master and to stop having that kind of relationship with his master. Of course, eventually he could adopt or take under his wing a different apprentice, but the original relation was meant to finish. With an older samurai and a younger samurai, again, that relation was supposed to end as soon as the younger samurai grew older. Okay, and finally, all these sex acts were not expected, and people themselves did not understand these acts, these relationships, as conforming or forming an identity. Okay, so same-sex sex did not represent the formation of homosexual identities. Okay. Then I told you before that the year 1868 was really important. Okay, in this particular time, Emperor Meiji came into power. Okay, and he was really important because he held both political power and also religious one. Okay, at the same time. Before, the emperor was only a symbolic figure. Okay, with some religious connotation. But with Emperor Meiji, he held the power of both politics and religion. Okay, and he came to be represented as the Holy Father of the entire nation. Okay, with each member or each citizen in Japan as their subjects. Okay, what happened with each individual man is that if the emperor was represented as the Holy Father of the entire nation, each individual man was represented as the Holy Father of their respective households. Okay, so with this we see the introduction of a religious connotation that was not there before, okay, to how sex and gender was understood, okay. So here you have it, okay. However, and you may say, okay, after many centuries of same-sex practices, maybe the beginning of this new policy meant the end of these four contexts that we have discussed. It didn't, okay, at all. Instead, as Deborah Samoon shows, okay, it made the transitory nature of these relationships even more prevalent, even more relevant, okay? According to her, the state, after 1868, started to promote the appearance of non-heterosexual characters, okay, and personality, characters in media as a way of setting a counterexample of that basically showed people how not to be, how not to act, okay. However, the number of gay, well, not so much lesbian, but gay characters at least significantly increased, okay, over the years. Okay. Yeah, as you can see, these non-heterosexual characters were used as a way of showing citizens how to behave, how to be the fathers of the nations they were expected to be, okay? So, in many stories and in many pieces of that time, we have like the fight of the heterosexual heroes and the evil, not so heterosexual villains, okay? And I'm avoiding the word gay because they were not always gay. They were just not heterosexual, which is not the same, or it shouldn't be, or it's not, okay? So for heroes, we have that they are normally sent on a quest to discover their place in society, okay? Their point of the starting point tend to be close to that of the villain, okay? They might have something in common, okay? A history together, maybe the villain was his boss, his father, his uncle, his neighbor, but something close to them, okay? And their stories normally revolved around finding heterosexual love, okay? Growing old and finding heterosexual love. However, in the case of the villains, okay, we have individuals who have gone beyond their respective time acting as non-heterosexual. Okay, they made their non-heterosexual practices almost an identity, okay, an identity that had to be punished, okay, and they were often presented as being outside. And you might ask, okay, what's the meaning of being outside? Okay, according to Maria Dolores Patricia Martinez, Japanese society has a very clear notion and uses the notion of outside a lot, okay? Outside normally means being outside of the social norm, okay? So engaging in non-normative actions or acts. But in popular culture, this also means being outside that more literal meaning, like being from another country, being from another planet, being from another realm of existence, okay? If you remember, as the other presenters told you, that there were many examples of non-heterosexual characters who were appearing in science fiction settings or fantasy settings. Here we have an example. That's why, for instance, we don't have many examples of lesbian characters, but we have sukubai, for instance, acting as or having non-heterosexual a non-heterosexual nature as part of their own identities, or as being part of their own definition as succubi. Yeah, succubi. Okay. So yeah, so something beyond the world of the characters, and sometimes it just meant being outside meant that they were older than the main characters. Okay, so we normally have heroes versus villains, where heroes are individuals in their paths of becoming, with examples of adults, whereas villains are normally wrongly consolidated adults. Okay, and here we have a rumor. We have Cloud and Sephiroth, who you might say, okay, they are not, or they never engage in same-sex practices. That's absolutely true. However, if we use the different contexts that we have discussed so far, we at least can use it to understand how, especially Sephiroth, is formed, is constructed as a villain. Okay. So if we look at the relation, they have a past together, okay, as a subordinate and a superior. Even though as the game progresses, there are some changes to it, okay, or at least Cloud discovered things that were not supposed to be that way. Okay, Cloud at different points in the story questions and challenges himself in relation to Sephiroth voices. Okay. Sephiroth doesn't show any interest in heterosexual love, and more importantly, he kills who is probably the main heterosexual interest for Cloud, which is Iris. Spoilers. Okay. And what we have to understand is that if there is, and if this is not a rumor, if we are to understand their relation as something real, is that the potential is of their relations tacit and derivative, okay, and depends on an entire context that has been going on for centuries in Japan, okay. And we have more examples. I mean, Final Fantasy is full of these examples. We have Tidus and Yuna, and then we have Seymour, who marries Yuna, but then for the wrong reasons, I guess, or he's not really interested in anything related to love, or we have other examples with Rainy and Edge and Face. Face eventually loses who could be his romantic interest, and then, let's say, like, invites the evil inside him, okay? But we also have characters that are not villains, okay? And they are more recent examples, and they are normally characters who are presented as fools, as characters that you could laugh at, even if they are protagonists, or even if they are the friends of the protagonist. They are also represented as characters that you could laugh at, okay? And they are fools because either they find themselves like being at fault, okay, and they present themselves in a funny way, or maybe because the game believes that their not so normative identities must be punished. And since they are not the villains, they are not at the receiving end of the physical aggression, they are at the receiving end of this form of justice in the form of being punished by the criticism or the laughing carried out by their friends. Okay, we have Kanji as probably the best example. In Persona 4, for many of you who have played this fantastic game, he has serious doubts about his own identity. Many of these doubts are some kind resolved during the game. However, at several points, the other characters, especially the male ones, laugh at him or make fun of him. Okay, and even in some of the spin-offs, such as Persona Q, okay, which was released almost 2 years ago, even at that point in which the problem should be solved, there are still jokes going around Kanji because of his doubts. Okay, and this sometimes steps outside of the games themselves. Okay, almost 3 years ago.